Iman, it was 3 days in which we heard so much of the assertions that were made by the KZN Police Commissioner. And there were question marks around evidence, around being tested and testing his evidence therein as well. And today, his boss will hit the stand, and it's going to be another day of wanting to know exactly what has been happening.
It is a nail-biter, no doubt, Arabile. With every word that's uttered here at the Commission, there are so many more questions, I guess, that are left to be answered. And someone who's going to fill in some of those gaps, hopefully, will be the National Police Commissioner, Fannie Masemola. Jeremy Vearey is, of course, a former insider. Some would say still an insider in many ways, Jeremy, because you observe this and you know the complexion of what's happening very intently, but you also know the networks that spill and flow out of this. There are a lot of questions to answer. We'll get into Richards Bay Minerals and what Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi had to say about that last week. But let's start with Fannie Masemola himself, for those who aren't that familiar, and he's the man with whom the buck stops, effectively.
Yes, he's the accounting officer in terms of the law. So everything that happens under his purview or while he's in office is his case to answer for. So that's the first thing we must know. The buck stops with him, and as we say in the police, it's where we slaughter, skin, and dry it.
Okay, so hopefully it's going to be one of those moments where he can create more insight and bring more insight to the scene that Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi has set for us. We're going to just tease our viewers into ensuring that they watch in the 7 o'clock hour, because that's when you and I are really going to break down what Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi was talking about, the deployment of the task force at the Richards Bay Minerals, and why that's such an important feature of his testimony to watch. But for now, we'll just, again, try to bring our viewers closer to who Masemola is. Now, we know that he was appointed in 2022. The president appointed him, and there was a lot of, support for his appointment. Fast forward to 2025 and the sidelines of the Interpol conference earlier this year, the president basically, on the announcement that Masemola made of the return of this now contested 121 dockets back to the PKTT, the Political Killings Task Team, the president viewed it as imprudent for the leadership of SAPS to start tinkering with areas and issues that are contained in the allegations that are made by Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi, which encompasses those dockets, and also that these were no ordinary matters or exercise of administrative powers. Anyway, just to summarize all of that, there are some tensions then between the acting police commissioner, the presidency, and Masemola over this decision. But it just does tell us what the contemporary picture is of him within the broader picture of enforcement in the country.
I think the president is entitled to his view, but it must be understood that General Masemola is a police officer like anybody else. It came to his intentions that there were dockets that were unattended to, on which tasks had to be executed, warrants had to be executed, further investigations that had stalled for a period. When it came to his attention, he acted operationally and correctly. He sent it back and ensured that it gets dealt with expeditiously, in the interest of justice, in the interest of the victims, their families, and closure in those particular cases, and to protect evidence and ensure that there's continuity in the investigation. It had to be sent back to the same team. You couldn't very well take those dockets, go send it to somebody else at a station who has to learn themselves into that thing, and then go stand in a court and appear doubtful about what they are. It required the intimacy of the involvement of the original investigators to take those matters further.
And we can't dispute that, because, as you say, there's an anatomy of investigation, a familiarity with the cases, some of which were already ready to kind of move on to the next level. But I want to circle back to a gap in accountability. I mean, if he took the step now, why didn't he take the step in the beginning? Given, as we know from the very beginning, that the president said he has an outstanding record in helping, for example, with the de-escalation of violence in the very province of KwaZulu-Natal. This was in the lead up to our first democratic elections, and also he had a great deal of experience, I think, during his time as the Deputy National Police Commissioner in reducing the number of cash-in-transit heists. This operationally would have been something that he needed to be aware of and needed to act upon much sooner than the moment that Mkhwanazi brought it to the public domain.
I don't want to speak for the National Commissioner here, but I want to just highlight something General Mkhwanazi did point out, that the man was on leave around about the time when these case dockets were removed. So some of the key issues that affect here was at a time when there was another person acting. So while he ultimately would have to respond when he comes back from leave, the question should also be asked, that question should be asked of the person who was acting while he was on leave.
How important is his testimony going to be today, Jeremy? Just in a couple of sentences. I mean, every day here seems like a day where, you know, we kind of sit back with our eyes wide open, and sometimes we're just incredulous at what we're hearing. How important is what Masemola has to say today, and what questions do you specifically want to hear him answer?
Firstly, we need to understand he's the repository of more knowledge about this situation than Mkhwanazi has. Okay? In the sense that he might be privy to other kind of factors that might have been involved in the removal of these cases from his later investigations that Mkhwanazi, from his particular vantage point in the province, might not know. There might be other intelligence matters within his purview that might add additional or cast additional light on some of the allegations made, because he knows more. He knows everything in the police, or he ought to know everything, and he has access, if he doesn't know it off his fingers, to drawing on a wide scope of information beyond what General Mkhwanazi can. And I think it's important that we remember that. And because he has that, his answers and responses would be more authoritative, I would think, in terms of the wider context than what General Mkhwanazi might be able to particularly tease out.
And what we're so desperate for as South Africans, you know, all of the evidence, or a lot of the evidence that Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi shared with us over the last 3 days of the Commission, as we head to day 4, converging around the role of Fannie Masemola, the National Police Commissioner, effectively his boss. And we want to pick up some of the threads of that testimony from last week, especially when it comes to issues that he raised around this mining company called Richards Bay Minerals and the murders of several of their executives. And Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi telling the Commission that he had deployed a team there of detectives and task force members for the period of a year, apportioning some budget to that endeavor, having pulled them back, and then later getting a message from a task force member who says, what am I doing here? I have some concerns. Where was the National Police Commissioner in all of this as the central accounting officer, the ultimate accounting officer for the police operationally? What is fishy about all of this that he would have to shed light on at this commission today? And Jeremy Veary is with me, as he has been over the last couple of days. Jeremy, this is something that you had raised a red flag about. Why?
Firstly, it deals with the company itself. Richards Bay Minerals is basically owned by a multinational. Rio Tinto mine has 85% stake in it. Another multinational, BHP Billiton, has the other larger stake in it, and then there are some smaller local stakeholders. So the first question is, what justified sending the task force, who are there to deal with high-risk operations, to go and get involved in the protection of a particular company or its individuals or its CEOs? Now, understanding the fact that the current CEO is an American. The people who were killed before, the first one, I think it was Nico Swartz, the general manager back no, he was the second one in 2021. The HR manager, Ronnie Nzimande, was killed in 2016. And then other company. But what makes it particularly now a higher risk compared to the before that justifies the deployment of the task force? And what makes Richards Bay Minerals so special over in other companies? Is it because of the multinational stake interest? Because no other companies are afforded this privilege of having a task force. The second question is, because they are only used in high-risk situations, the task force, there must be a threat that is commensurate or serious enough to warrant their deployment. Now the question is, what was the threat? And second question is, what threat analysis informed that? So the National Commissioner will have to tell us these things. But the other issue, if I listen to General Mkhwanazi's testimony, although he didn't say it clearly, is what undue influence possibly was involved in whether or not, in the decision made by General Masemola to utilize the task force in that particular situation.
What you're thinking is the type of interference that talks about political interference. Yes. Why is Masemola's possible evidence in this regard so important? Because as you've already said, the buck stops with him.
Yes.
That permission and authorization would have to come from him.
That is correct. It needs to be coming from him. If it didn't come from him, it will be very disturbing, but it must come it came from him, if I listen to General Mkhwanazi's testimony. So he has to answer what motivated the decision and whether or not there were other influences in the decision. If it only involves him deciding, he needs to answer what threat analysis or what threat existed. And thirdly, we need to understand the public. You know, we went through Marikana, where we also learned where the task force was deployed, and understand, if you deploy that unit in a situation knowing full well that they are there for a high risk thing, you are elevating the response to the threat that you have. Because they are not trying to respond like public order policing or like your vans from your station respond. They respond, they're the sharp edge of the police. So that needs to be answered.
Okay.
It's very crucial that the public understands why this precise instrument was used here.